gives me such an amazing pleasure to introduce her. And again, she too needs no introduction. She's an internationally renowned speaker who is widely regarded as the byword for diplomacy. She's the former Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and she's regarded as the architect who delivered the famous Paris Climate Agreement after that failure in Copenhagen a number of years earlier. She is an activist, she's an author, she presents her own podcast, and she's joining us live from her home in Costa Rica. Christiana Figueres, you are so welcome. The first thing I wanted to ask you about is your new book, because you're quite literally in my head at the moment. It's my audible read, Listening to the Future We Choose. And what's really remarkable about the book, because there's so much doom and gloom, fear and pessimism naturally around climate change. And yet for all of these consequences that we know that you have outlined, the book is hugely optimistic. There's very little of the book attributed to the kind of the doomsday scenarios. And I'm just kind of wondering, how is it that knowing all of the risks that we face, that you are choosing optimism even in dark times?
We honestly don't see what fear, grief, paralysis, and doom thinking is actually going to contribute to the solution. I frankly, when I get afraid or despair or grief, I go into a black box and I get paralyzed, and we all do. So yes, we have to make space for that fear and that grief, but we also have the responsibility to climb out of that box and move over to a much more positive mindset that says we actually can do this. As the companies previous to this conversation on the panel are showing, this is doable. If we go at it pessimistically thinking there's no way we're going to do that, well, chances are we won't succeed, or you won't succeed. But if we go at it from an optimistic perspective, there's no guarantee of success. Let's take that. But we have a much larger possibility to succeed if we go at it from a positive, engaging, committed mindset that says we're going to do everything that we can.
What are the real upsides if we can do what you have invited us to do, to come together and look beyond the scary statistics?
Decarbonizing the global economy would mean that we as humans, those who live in cities, would live in cities that are not crowded, polluted, and loud. They would live in cities that are actually interconnected with much more smart, connected transport that is not polluting. We would have clean air. We would save 7 million lives a year that we're losing to air pollution. Those who live in rural areas or work in rural areas would be benefited from regenerated soils, from higher productivity in their agricultural practices. So it is, just from the human experience point of view, it is definitely beneficial to move in this direction.
Back to the world of finance, because Christiana, when we think of banks, we don't really tend to think of banks in heroic terms generally, let alone when it comes to climate change. But why do you think that this could potentially be a moment for the financial sector to lead and to potentially shine?
It's very clear that wherever finance goes, so go emissions. If you finance high carbon assets, whatever they are, they will have the attendant greenhouse gases locked in for decades to come, whether that's infrastructure, whether that's power, whether that's energy, whether that's buildings, whether that's agriculture, whatever sector you're in. If you finance high carbon practices and high carbon assets, they will have those high carbon emissions for decades to come. So that is why it's important to understand wherever finance goes today, so go emissions tomorrow.
The business case for climate and sustainability seems to finally have been made. Is that part of the optimism that you have, despite all of the running out of time that you mentioned?
Absolutely. And I'm so grateful that we have made the business case, because frankly, let's look at the other option. If people had to choose between being responsible and being sustainable and being profitable, where do you think they're going to go? But the fact is that because those are aligned, because there is a coincidence of imperatives, we have the moral imperative. You want to go way down bottom, the moral imperative. We have the economic imperative. We have the technological imperative with all the technologies that we have developed and continue to develop. We have the financial imperative. All of those imperatives are actually aligned. You no longer have to choose between being responsible or being sustainable and being profitable. That's the good news. You actually, if you want to do either, you have to do both. They both have come hand in hand.
Why is this a decisive decade, and what can be achieved within it?
It is the decisive decade because over this decade, collectively, all of us humans are actually deciding the future of humanity. Now, that may sound like an exaggeration, but it's not. It is no exaggeration. Over this decade, we are, whether we're doing it consciously or not, it doesn't matter. We are choosing our future. That's why the book is called, is entitled like that. We are choosing our future because we basically have a decision that we're every day making. By 2030, it will be inevitable that we will be at the door of a world that is in constant destruction and untold human misery, the likes of which we have never seen. By 2030, that die will have been cast. Conversely, if our investment decisions, our agricultural practices, our corporate decisions, our lending decisions, our human behavior decisions every day are actually toward decarbonizing, then by 2030, we will not only have averted a dystopian world, but we will actually open the door to a world that is much better than the world that we have now. Because we will open the door to a world, as I said before, where cities are clean and not congested, where agricultural practices are so much more sustainable, where transport is so much better, where food production is actually increased, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the decade. By 2030, the die will have been cast. We will be then irretrievably along one or the other journey. And that's why this is the decisive decade. That's why we all have to wake up.
Christiana, it's been an absolute privilege to speak to you today. And I'm so sorry we just couldn't get to you with all of the questions and comments that have been coming in. But it has been a real privilege. And we wish you well in your endeavours. And also, please stay safe, because I know there could be one or two more tropical storms on the way. So stay safe. And thank you so much for joining us.